Welcome to the Sex and Psychology Podcast. My name is Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. On today's episode, I'm going to be speaking with sex therapist Dr. David Ley, who is a clinical psychologist based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where he directs a large behavioral health and substance abuse outpatient program. He is also the author of several incredible books, including The Myth of Sex Addiction, Insatiable Wives, and Ethical Porn for Dicks. Dr. Ley is one of the media's go-to experts on all things sex. Today we're going to be talking about the psychology of cuckolding, a sexual practice in which someone is aroused by the idea of watching or listening while their partner has sex with another person. It turns out that cuckolding is a surprisingly popular sexual interest, and David happens to know a lot about it because he's literally written the book on the subject. He and I have also collaborated on a scientific study about it. So we have a lot to say about cuckolding, and I know you're going to love this episode. So let's get to it. So happy to have you here and to have a chance to talk about cuckolding.
It's always fun to talk about it.
I agree. So I think let's start by talking about kind of how we both came to learn about cuckolding in the first place. I mean, for me, this was something that never came up once in graduate school. And it's not something I actually encountered until about a decade ago when a reader of my blog sent in a question where he asked, why do so many guys like to watch their wives sleep with other men? And my initial thought was, well, does that happen? I didn't really know anything about it. I was a little naive at that point as a budding sex researcher. And I certainly didn't know that there was a term for it. And so I started doing some digging. And that's when I first encountered your work and your book, Insatiable Wives, which, by the way, I've recommended to a ton of people. So I think I probably
Thank you.
I think I probably deserve a kind of the royalties at this point. But
Well, I would say that given how much I've recommended your book, if you want to trade royalties back and forth here,
okay, fine, maybe not. No, just kidding. Well, so I read your book and I wrote a response to this reader. I published it on the blog. And it became one of the most read articles on my site. And year in and year
wow,
out, it's still one of the most popular articles. And
yeah.
that's when I started to realize just how massively popular this is. So
hmm
I'm curious, when did you first learn about cuckolding and how did you decide to write a whole book on the subject?
So, as you mentioned, I have a day job, running a large business, and it that can be challenging. And so, I've always worked as a clinical psychologist and doing sex therapy with alternative sex crowd, kind of poly, non-monogamous, kinky, etc. And uh, many years ago, back in like 2007, 2008, I was kind of struggling with, honestly, with depression in my professional life, and I decided, hey, I need some kind of project. So I collected data for a study about non-monogamy that I'd never actually published. It wasn't a very good study, but as I was doing that, I encountered these couples that told me that they lived the hot wife cuckold lifestyle. I'd never heard of it, and they explained that the wife went off and had sex with other men, and the husband, was very enthusiastically supportive of it. And kind of like you, most psychologists and therapists get no training in sexuality in grad school, and I certainly had none. Certainly none about cuckolding. And my initial impression was, wow, that can't be healthy. For the wife to go off and be sexual with other people without the husband and everything else. But I, as I looked at these couples, they were really, really healthy. They had remarkable communication skills. They had been married for decades. They had successful careers, remarkably successful careers, in fact. And I was forced to realize that was reacting based on kind of bias. And so I started digging into the research and found there was none. There was really no scholarly research. There was one study back in the 1990s. I think you and I found it later, published by Wernick in Israel. That was basically the only study I could find of anybody kind of looking at this phenomenon clinically. And that study was a study of basically letters submitted to, I think, Penthouse about wife sharing.
Mhm.
So, because there was nothing about it, and remember, I'm depressed, I'm kind of looking for, some self-directed project. So I said, well, I've always wanted to write a book. Let me investigate this. And so I spent, about a year diving into the literature on evolutionary psychology, on female sexuality, on non-monogamy, but then also interviewing couples around the country as I traveled. And it was fun. I mean, I would post ads on Craigslist back when Craigslist had personal ads. And, I'd say, are you living this cuckold hot wife lifestyle? I'd like to talk to you. And they would send me naked pictures of the wife. And I would say, thank you very much. She's lovely. But I really just want to talk with you. And then I would interview these folks and learn about the diversity of this. And at the end of the day, I had this book that just kind of described my journey trying to understand this. And it got published really quickly because, again, there wasn't anything out there. And for me, it was really fascinating. My wife actually describes that book as her favorite of my books because of the not because it's about hot wives, but because it's about kind of this sort of wonderment that I had at this fascinating, positive, healthy aspect of these people's lives. And I had no idea when I wrote it that I would still be talking about it 10 years later, and that it would be even more relevant to like freaking national politics now. And like you, I write on Psychology Today, and one of the articles I wrote very early on about cuckolding and why would you want to watch your wife with other men is one of my most popular pieces. I mean, it literally has, I think, it alone has like 2 million reads.
Mhm. So it sounds like cuckolding changed your life and it also saved your life. So
Yeah, because that was the fun thing was after I was doing all those interviews and reading and writing and all this stuff, I wasn't depressed anymore
Mhm.
because even though I wasn't having sex with these beautiful wives, just hearing about the hot, healthy sex that they were having changed me.
Now, you mentioned this term hot wifing, which some people might not be familiar with. So, what is the difference
Right.
between cuckolding and hot wifing?
Well, you can go down quite a rabbit hole of this,
Mhm.
and like everything, humans argue about what a certain term means, but roughly in the cuckolding and hot wifing, I use the general term wife sharing to describe these folks, but cuckolding tends to be a practice where the husband is a bit more submissive and takes more of a passive role in the practice of sharing his wife with other men. Sometimes there is some humiliation element to it, but not always. In contrast, hot wifing looks a little bit more like swinging, where the husband is more active, is oftentimes engaging in group sex with the wife as she is with other men. So folks within the communities will make these very hard distinctions, and some of the men sometimes will say, "No, I'm not a cuckold. My wife is a hot wife," and they get very defensive about it. Basically, it is just describing a little bit about some of the ways that they enact this wife sharing activity.
Sure. And as is true with everything else in human sexuality, different people have different definitions for all of these terms.
Exactly.
Now, when it comes to cuckolding, you've talked a little bit about some variations in some of the scenarios and how people define these things, but is there kind of a typical cuckolding scenario in, say, a male female relationship? What does that look like?
Um, so I think that first, this is evolving, and as it is becoming more mainstream, there are more younger people kind of engaging in this. But as I met these couples, and as we kind of dove into this, It has tended to be somewhat older couples in the 40s, oftentimes couples that have already had kids. It is something that is usually initiated by the husband, who goes to the wife and says, "Hey, I've kind of had this fantasy of seeing you with other people." And oftentimes the wife, reacts with kind of shock and some concern, because women who engage in infidelity suffer far more stringent kind of consequences and punishment socially than do unfaithful men. And so wives are afraid that they're oftentimes afraid that their husband thinks they're a slut, or that they will be ostracized if their infidelity is exposed and such. But as the couple kind of shares this fantasy, and the husband, sometimes kind of starts to almost seduce the wife to the idea of being with other men, pointing out other men, maybe, helping her to hook up with other men on apps or things like that. The couple kind of evolves sort of towards this. Sometimes the wife will be sexual with other men that the couple knows. Sometimes the wife is sexual with other men that the couple doesn't know, and it comes in all flavors, and it really gets negotiated now around the couple sort of dynamics, and particularly I view a lot of these rules within monogamy as anxiety management strategies. The sometimes the husband is afraid that the wife will fall in love with the man, and so he is careful to choose men that he doesn't think she would fall in love with. But sometimes the husband, really enjoys the idea of her being with a man who is kind of more manly and more dominant than the husband feels, because the husband wants to roll around in some of that humiliation kind of feeling. Interesting historical side note: the Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, that masochism is named after, back in the 1800s, he advertised in the German newspapers of the day that he was looking for a virile, energetic young man to befriend his wife, because Masoch really wanted to enjoy the humiliation of being cuckolded by his wife. And so it's fascinating how long that history goes back.
It is so fascinating. And it's so interesting, too, that you point out how it's usually the men who are initiating this in these male-female relationships. And I've received lots of emails from men over the years saying, "How do I convince my wife to sleep with other people?" But I've never received an email from a woman saying, "How do I convince my husband to let me sleep with other people?" So there's some interesting gender
Yeah.
dynamic there.
So I have now. I didn't used to, but you're right. I mean, I'm always willing to acknowledge that humans are complex beings, and that there are dark sides to some of this. And I have seen and worked with men who engage in kind of non-consensual behavior, trying to trick their wife, intoxicate their wife into being with other men against the wife's will, and that is dangerous and unhealthy and disturbing in all kinds of ways. But I have recently, over the past couple of years, started hearing from women who would like to be non-monogamous, and their husbands or boyfriends are just not into it. And I think it's an interesting reflection of the development of feminism and sexual empowerment, that we're now starting to kind of see that.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of truth to that, because I see in my own research on sexual fantasies that a lot of women have fantasized about this scenario precisely, where they're having sex
Hmm.
while their partner watches, but they may not feel empowered to act on that fantasy or desire, or to even tell their partner about it, just because of the ways in which female sexuality tends to be more harshly judged and held to a different standard than male sexuality. So I think there's probably
Right.
something to that.
In your book, how many, I forget, was it 45% of men reported that they had fantasized about seeing their partner with other men?
It was a majority. It was about, I think it was about 51, 52%, a slight
Wow.
majority.
That's just extraordinary.
Yeah. And there was we'll talk more about this a little later. There was a difference based on sexual orientation where gay and bisexual identified men had these fantasies more than heterosexual men. And that's, a significant number of women, I don't recall the exact number off the top of my head, but it was about a third, I want to say, of women who said that they had also fantasized about watching their partner. But I also asked about the reverse role of, having sex while your partner watches you, and more women had
Hmm.
fantasized about that than
That's
the
interesting.
reverse. Yeah. Now, so what is it that draws people to cuckolding? Whenever I talk about this, I get a lot of people who question, how could you possibly find that arousing, right? Because they see this as really threatening or the ultimate
Hmm.
betrayal. And it's like, wait, you're going to sleep with someone while I watch? Like, that just seems really insulting. So what's the appeal? What is it that people find erotic about this? And why do some people find it to be really threatening?
Well, like everything, it is complex. It is multiply determined. There are different factors for different people. Some of the main kind of themes that I found were, one significant one is, simple voyeurism. And, people that, men that would say, I would rather watch my wife have sex with other people than watch some stranger in pornography, because I know what my wife looks like when she's having fun and enjoying herself. And I know that this is real. She's actually enjoying it. And I sometimes wonder if the rise in cuckolding fantasy has some relationship to increased acceptance and viewing of pornography, as people, kind of incorporate more of a voyeur watching sexual behavior into their sexual repertoire.
Mhm.
There's also, again, particularly we're talking about, males watching their partner. And we don't, one of the things that I think we don't know a lot about the female motivations. And I would like to know more about that. But in men, one of the other significant components is what I call kind of vicarious bisexuality. That there are men who really would like to engage in sexual activity with other men, but they have a lot of moral or social prohibitions against it. And they can kind of use their wife's body basically as a vehicle to vicariously have sex with other men. And what's interesting is that those guys are really, really interested in getting guys with big penises for their wives. And they get really, really obsessed. I mean, it's funny because the husband sometimes are more of a size queen than the wife is. And sometimes the men will incorporate kind of a forced bisexuality component into the cuckolding fantasy, and be forced to perform oral sex on the other man, the bull, so to speak, by the wife. And well, then the husband's not really gay, he's not really bisexual, he's being forced into it. And so I think those are the two kind of main components. Now, one of the things that I also talk about, though, is that these folks, I think, in some ways, have found a strategy to kind of hijack jealousy and to turn the feelings of jealousy into sexual excitement. And the research around sperm competition, it was very significant, when I wrote the book. And in the years since, some of that sperm competition research has kind of fallen apart and not been replicated. So if I could write the book again, that is one of the things that I would change, is the degree to which I treat that research as very credible. But
Mhm.
I think that there is a really strong component there that, for whatever reason, in whatever way, men get more aroused at the presence of other, at the cues of other men, needing to kind of compete, so to speak, against those men, to put more sperm on the playing field, to compete,
Mhm.
to and I think that these folks have interestingly found a way to take the energy of that jealousy and competition and turn it into excitement.
Mhm. Now, some people seem to be more into cuckolding than others. And if we turn to current events, it's interesting if we talk about political conservatives because they publicly proclaim an aversion to cuckolding in any other form of non-monogamy. And in fact, they use the term cuck oftentimes as a
Mhm.
slur to denigrate other people they see as weak. And what's interesting is that despite that sort of public aversion, they actually seem to be disproportionately drawn to this sexual interest. And prominent case in point would be Jerry Falwell Jr., who allegedly
Mhm.
watched his wife have sex with their pool boy for years. There's also a finding that you shared on Twitter the other day with showing that there are more porn searches for cuckolding in more conservative parts of the U.S. And
Right.
my own data on sexual fantasies find that conservatives fantasize about cuckolding more than liberals. So what's up with that? Why is there this political link to cuckolding?
Isn't that interesting? I mean, your readers can also they can Google cuckolding porn 2016 GOP convention, and there are videos that people made of cuckolding scenes around the GOP convention because there were a bunch of them apparently. And it goes beyond even Falwell and those folks. I mean, there are significant allegations that Paul Manafort, Trump's campaign president, was into cuckolding and watching his wife with other men, apparently in a kind of somewhat non-consensual and manipulative kind of way. And Roger Stone also has been long known as a pretty out swinger who refers to himself as a trisexual, and famously was also posting personals ads looking for muscular men to have sex with his wife while he watched. So yeah, it is interesting what's going on there. One thing I do like to point out is, and again, I'm kind of a history geek, and so I like to know where these kind of things come from. And the term cuck and cuckold actually derives from the the breeding practices of this bird called a cuckoo. And the cuckoo will go and lay its eggs in the nest of other birds. And because the cuckoo's baby hatches before the other birds, the cuckoo bird will grow up faster, oftentimes push out the other eggs, kill other birds, and consume more of the food. So naturalists back in the 1500s, 1600s, they saw this happening and they said basically that's what happens when a man's wife cheats on him and he doesn't know, and he ends up raising the children of other men, and those children consume his wealth, and he is now investing in children that are not genetically related to him. So those men were perceived as weak, powerless. Their wives were, these kind of vicious kind of monsters that were cheating on the husband. And so the term cuck, and interestingly, when we take pictures with each other and we hold our fingers in a V up behind the other person's head to kind of make fun of them, haha,
Mhm.
that actually derives from the old way that people indicated that a man was being cuckolded by putting horns above his head.
Hmm.
And so it's funny that this message is still here today. So when the conservatives are calling each other cuck, they're saying, oh, you're weak, you're being unfaithful to the spirit of conservatism and everything else, and so they're really condemning it. But the interesting thing, and your research talks a lot about this as well, the more taboo something is, the more condemned it is. For some people, the more sexually charged and exciting it becomes.
Mhm.
And so I had this one guy write me, and he said, look, he said, I'm a skinhead. He said, I'm a white Nazi, but people don't know that the thing that I fantasize the most is my wife cheating on me with a Jewish or a person of color, because that is just so powerful to me, because I'm taught to hate it and fear it, and yet it turns me on.
Mhm. So fascinating. And yeah, that appeal of the taboo is certainly a big part of, I think, what explains so many of our erotic turn ons and why taboo themes are so popular in our sexual fantasies in general.
Exactly.
Now, up until this point, we've kind of focused on cuckolding as it occurs in male female relationships, but we certainly know that it happens in same sex relationships too. And in fact, you and I have collaborated on a study together on gay cuckolding, along with sex advice columnist Dan Savage. And we surveyed around 500 or so, mostly gay identified men who said they'd fantasized about cuckolding before. We published the results in an academic journal. And I was just wondering if you could tell my listeners a little bit about how that study came about in the first place and what you think were the most interesting things we learned when we started looking at cuckolding in male same sex relationships compared to the male female relationships.
So that study, it actually came about from Dan Savage. He gets letters and requests about cuckolding all the time, and he's even written and said that he is kind of tired of it. But he had famously said that there is no such thing as cuckolding in gay couples because gay men love to watch their husbands with other men, and it doesn't have the same kind of flavor that it does in heterosexuals. But then all of a sudden he started getting these letters from gay cuckolds, and he wrote me and he said, what do you think's going on? And he suggested, he said, is this because of the Supreme Court? He said, when the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage in 2015, did they now create kind of a taboo that then it then became more exciting when husbands could see their legally married husband now cheating on them? And so I was like, well, let's do a study. And Dan said, well, I've never done a study. And I said, cool. And then because I'm not, a great researcher, we reached out to you and said, could you help us like make this a real study? Because we've got a good idea, but we don't know what to do. And luckily, I mean, you were interested, and it was just fun. It was a neat project and fun, exciting, and we found out that there wasn't any data to really support the theory that Dan and I had suggested, that this was related to, kind of legalization of gay marriage. But what we did find just so interesting, was some of the things that we've talked about, that, cuckolding, as we looked at, kind of Google trends and such like that, we found that cuckolding fantasies or searches for cuckold were more popular in countries that were more, kind of machismo. Italy, interestingly, is the country that has the highest searches for Google on cuckolding per capita. But we found, I think, the most compelling piece was that men who were into cuckolding with their husband, who were generally pretty healthy guys,
Mhm.
and that engaging in this behavior was generally fairly positive and healthy for the couple. That it was not, the end of the relationship. It was not destructive. But it was an adventurous kind of exciting behavior that the men could consensually make part of their lives.
Mhm. And that was the piece that the media picked up when our study came out. CNN actually published an article, and I believe the title of it was something along the lines of "Cuckolding can be good for some couples," study says. And they
Right.
they drew upon our study, your book, Insatiable Wives. And I distinctly remember when the article came out, I read it in the morning and I thought, oh, this is a great article. It's really true to the science. But then it just like blew the fuck up on Twitter, and not in a good way. There were all these people, like all of a sudden, who were making personal attacks on us, on the author of the article, who I know has received some
Mhm.
death threats for having written that.
Mhm.
People were calling CNN the cuckold news network, which is actually kind of funny.
Yeah.
Um, so what do you remember of that experience, and why do you think there was so much backlash? Why was our study so controversial?
Oh God. I think it was information that people were scared to hear. I think that it challenged their, conceptions, and it poked some very fragile egos. I, you know, and like you, I mean, I saw this blowing up, and I was like, whoa. And I had this kind of infamous engagement with some guy on Twitter who I didn't know was like this very hugely popular right wing kind of guy who posted something about it. And I responded saying, the people who protest the most about this tend to be the ones that are the most into it. And that kind of went viral. Because again, I was kind of poking, and Tucker Carlson, covered it, and there's this just this hysterical video of him, like struggling to pronounce cuckold and acting like he doesn't know how to say the word or what the word means. But the funny thing is, I mean, like we said, the conservatives are running around calling each other cuck all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was just, I think the headline on Fox News about it was, the death of marriage. And it was just like, my God, could you make this a little more dramatic? Now, Lehmiller, Lay, and Savage are killing marriage. It was extraordinary.
Yeah, I think my favorite tweet said something to the effect of, our study was destroying Western civilization as we know it.
You aim high, aim big, or go home, right?
I had no idea what you guys were getting me into with that study.
Right. Yeah, I apologize for that. I mean, at that point, I'd certainly had my share of attack from in the media around sex addiction and stuff like that. But I thought this was just a silly little fun study. I had no idea it was going to generate that kind of attention. Fun times, fun times.
But I think it's also just so telling of how threatening and how controversial the idea of consensual non-monogamy is to so many people, that they would react so strongly and they would come after us so personally, and that they'd be sending death threats to the author of this article. It's just...
And then 2 years later, we have the Jerry Falwell Jr. scandal, and it's like, oh, you remember how you guys were attacking us about this? Huh. I mean, man, I wanted to go on Tucker Carlson and say, hey, you remember this?
Now, what was interesting was I wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post about cuckolding and sort of the psychology behind why conservatives are more into it than liberals. And I was expecting the same kind of round of attacks that happened the first time, but it was just crickets, nothing really happened. Instead, I
was wondering.
Yeah, it was... most people are like, yep, that makes sense. That checks out. So
we beat them into submission. We won. We really did destroy civilization. Way to go, Justin.
Apparently, mission accomplished.
I think the truth just got too hard to deny, and so they prefer to go back into just pretending to be blind to it.
So let's talk about the future of cuckolding. I could potentially see a few different predictions here. One is that as consensual non-monogamy becomes more widely accepted, it's still got a ways to go before it gets to widespread acceptance, but if it becomes more widely accepted, will people feel freer to do it and kind of write their own relationship script? Or on the other hand, if the rate of marriage continues at an all-time low and, fewer people subscribe to the idea of lifelong monogamy, will the taboo aspect and the transgressiveness of cuckolding become less appealing? Or is cuckolding just kind of ingrained in us to find arousing and appealing? And so no matter what else changes, people will still be into it. I don't know. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think this fantasy is going to be around as long as religious conservative sexual values are around, and certainly those are not going to go away. Those communities, I think that adherence to some of those values may be shrinking, but the strongholds of Alabama and Utah and such, those sexually conservative, areas are not going to stop. They're not going to, openly and radically embrace non-monogamy. And so, as long as those communities have people that are growing up within them and becoming husbands and wives, that taboo and that exciting taboo is still going to be there. I think that the as non-monogamy becomes more acceptable, though, what I'm interested to see is kind of the evolution. And I've worked with some couples that started into non-monogamy around cuckolding, and then the wives got into it, and it turned into something that looked more like swinging, and then it turned into something that looked more like polyamory. And so that, I think, is an interesting kind of avenue that I'm excited to kind of watch, in terms of how this flavor of kind of relationship, or this entree into non-monogamy, evolves in people. And I wonder if cuckolding porn is going to remain as popular as it is. And that I don't know, because I think that the popularity of porn kind of reflects sexual fantasy, and it reflects the excitement du jour. People complain that there are a lot of racist elements in cuckold porn, and they're right. But those racist elements and the excitement of that racist taboo fantasy reflects the racism in society. Mm-hmm. It's not that these cuckold fantasies are creating racism. They are reflecting the struggle with racism that is within the people who are watching this porn. And so I'm interested to see, as our society hopefully becomes less racist and confronts these racist attitudes, does the excitement and taboo of those racist dynamics kind of go away? I'm just a student of watching human sexuality as it evolves, because I just think it's so fascinating and so revealing.
Yeah, we are all voyeurs of human sexuality.
Yeah, there you go. You're right.
So, according to David Ley, cuckolding is here to stay. Cuckolding cures depression. So, it is. It's the cure-all. But no, I appreciate what you said about how it'll be really interesting to see how this evolves going forward. And I think just more broadly in the world of consensual non-monogamy, we don't know enough about how those relationships begin and how they change form and what this means. I think there's this tendency to think that the cuckolds and the swingers and the open relationships and the polyamorous, that these are all totally different groups of people. But maybe there are more fluid, flexible boundaries between them, and one can kind of lead to the other, and maybe they're going back and forth. And maybe there's multiple variations of these different arrangements taking place within a given relationship. Mm-hmm. So certainly an area that's very fertile and ripe for research.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, David. This has been a very fun, very wide-ranging conversation. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. Can you tell us a little bit more about where we can go to learn about your work and maybe find some of your books, including Insatiable Wives?
DavidLayPhD.com. You'd think I would know my own website, right? DavidLayPhD.com. On Twitter, at Dr. David Ley. The last name, even though it sounds like get laid, it is Ley. And then, my books are on Amazon, and you can find them through my links and all that good stuff. Engage with me on Twitter. It's always a fun conversation.
Yeah, and you're happy to talk about cuckolding and beyond on social media.
Absolutely. If you can survive the attacks that we had a few years ago, you can survive anything.
Yep. Well, thank you again so much for your time and for your amazing insights. I really appreciate having you here. And thank you to my listeners. To keep up with new episodes of the podcast, you can visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on Apple, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the podcast. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want, which has a lot of fascinating information in there about cuckolding and more. So thanks again for listening. Until next time.